Welcome today's USP and Pharma Tech webinar, Modern Quality Techniques. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to join us. Next. Each registration is unique and grants the rights for individual registrants only to view this webinar. Sharing this webinar will unregister viewers either during or after this performance violates Pharmatech Associates copyright and it's prohibited. Next. If you have not already done so, we ask that you take time to read the Pharmatech Associates course disclaimer. You can download this presentation, including the disclaimer, from your USP Education account. Please follow the instructions in your confirmation email to download the presentation. Next. We have three presenters today. Stephanie Galding, Managing Director of Pharmatech Associates, Mike Porter, Vice President, Regulatory Compliance at Pharmatech Associates, and Elaine Lee, Senior Consultant, QA at Pharmatech Associates. Welcome and thank you to you all for presenting. I will now hand it over to Stephanie.
And thank you very much. We're very happy to be here today and talk about some modern quality techniques. As our host indicated, I've got joining me today Mike Porter, who is actually our head of operations here on the eastern side of the US. Mike, if you'd like to say hello and introduce yourself real quick.
Hello, everyone. I've been with Pharmatech about 1.5 years and over 35 years experience in the quality side of the pharmaceutical and medical device industry. So excited to meet you all today.
Yeah, and we've got Elaine Lee, who is one of our senior consultants, also joining us. If you want to say hi and tell us just a little bit about yourself.
Hi, this is Elaine. I'm happy to meet you all, and it's my pleasure to be giving my first USP webinar co-hosting with Stephanie and Mike. So I appreciate this opportunity. I have also about 35 years of experience in the industry, and I've been with Pharmatech about 4 years now, doing all kinds of QA fun activities.
Fantastic. Thank you both.
Thank you.
And with that, as the host mentioned, my name is Stephanie Galding. I am the managing director at Pharmatech, and much like Mike and Elaine, I've got over 30 years in the industry, mostly in quality and regulatory compliance. So we're really excited today to talk to you about some modern quality techniques. And as we've started in some of our previous discussions and previous courses that we've done with USP, really want to start our conversation today just kind of remembering that at the focus of this are the patients who take the medicines and use devices that we manufacture. And that really, in those cases, every dose really does matter for each of those patients. And in order to ensure that they get the doses that they need, we really are, it's really incumbent upon us to have a safe and reliable supply chain as part of that process. And so as we've done these series of webinars over the last year, we really are focusing on providing information that really helps organizations understand how we can satisfy those patient needs as part of the course of our actions. And we're going to start that conversation today actually with Elaine talking a little bit about patient-centric mindset, what that means, and how to potentially think about that from a drug development process. So Elaine?
Hi, everyone. We first, in our next slide, first slide, what does patient-centric mean? Centricity mean? It's actually an umbrella term that means patient-centered efforts and activities of an organization should engage patients. A really good example is I was reading a publication from the National Health Council, and after I finished reading it, I had to smile because it talks about company ABC, which is a company that I have worked with. And company ABC was developing a new formulation of topical medication indicated for acute dermatitis. They had come up with a very sophisticated formulation and wanted and gathered up a focus group of patients, intended patient group, and asked them if they prefer their new sophisticated formula versus the traditional white cream. And so the patients tried that formulation, and most patients preferred the traditional white cream that absorbs easy into the skin, whereas the new sophisticated formulation kind of left a residue on top of their skin. Now, at the same time, they asked this focus group their preference. Do they prefer a plastic tube, similar to, say, when you go to CVS or Walgreens and pick up a plastic tube of hydrocortisone versus a metal tube? And without a doubt, the patients preferred the plastic tube, indicating it was easier to squeeze out their medication and they could get every drop out, versus a metal tube. It was harder to press down, and after, when you roll the metal tube, sometimes there's sharp points and they would hurt themselves. So company ABC listened to the feedback from their patients and used a traditional formulation for their product and packaged it, their investment product, in the plastic tube. So this is a really good example of listening to our patients, getting their engagement, and developing products that meet their needs. In our next slide, we show that in the new drug development paradigm is changing. And we should recognize that all patients do not respond in the same way with their therapeutic dose, and their response can be differs too. So with that, with this new paradigm, we should address specific patient needs can drive the development of a new chemical molecule. And a good example, formulations that are IV infused typically involve the patients to schedule an appointment, travel to the medical facility, wait to receive their medication, and as they're called up next, they prepare their site. The nurse administers the drug. There are facility costs associated with that. After the drug is infused, they have to wait. The nurses want to make sure everything, all your vitals are or back to normal before they send you home. This may take half a day, a whole day. If we can consider alternative formulations, perhaps a sub-Q formulation where the patients can deliver the medication at home, this only reduces the burden of the patients and drives patient compliance. Now, in our next slide, we can implement human factors engineering in designing our medicines as well as our medical devices. Now, some of you may be saying, what is human factors engineering? Well, that's a really good question, because I didn't know myself until my daughter decided to obtain her master's degree in human factors engineering. So I was just curious, and she just told me this is a way to focus on your targeted group, whether it's consumers or patients, to make products user-friendly and listen to the feedback. She develops software formulations, new products for software. And so they look at how the screen is set up and what fonts look good and all these kind of things. Something that we all could possibly relate to is in an airplane. The pilot, everything should be right at the fingertips for the pilot. And they use human factors engineering to measure the distance, the typical distance of their fingers to the touch panel. What buttons are more important? What colors should the buttons be? Do they prefer a button, a click click, a turning knob? All these is considered when they design the console of an airplane, because passenger safety comes first. Now, how do we implement human factors engineering in our industry? Our next slide shows a medical device that did just this. This is not actual size, but this is called the Freedom Edge syringe infusion system, where slow infused products can be delivered safely in the comfort of a patient's home. This site provides the patient as well as their site excellent YouTube videos, very short sequence showing how you prepare the area to prepare your drug, how to prepare the drug, how to prepare the site, and finally, how to use this device. And it's usually a glass vial, and they show them how to puncture the top of the stopper and then attach tubing, and that tubing goes into this syringe, and after all the medication is taken into that syringe, you simply close the lid and you already have prepared your injection site, and you can just receive the medication there at home. This is not actual size, it's actually a little bit smaller. And I was reading the patient testimonials on this, and they just say it's so convenient. um, they're they're they never forget to take their dose. They can take it with them when they travel. They can take it with them to the beach. Requires no batteries. They can just slip it into their purse. So here's a great example of how we can use um, our new technology to develop and make delivery of medications friendly. Now, in our next slide, we show how you have probably seen the typical drug development roadmap where we start from drug discovery to post-surveillance, post-market surveillance. At these various touch points, there are patient-centric opportunities that if we just took a time to what can we do? One of those ways is, for the example, to use formulations and packaging components that the patient prefers. Another way is to make all our technical language user friendly in language the patients can understand. Everyone uses their smartphone. They search on a Google search. Why not make the wording user friendly? And when they open up a site, they touch that, available to them at a touch of a button are medical libraries, also written where they can understand. Um, Patient advocacy groups, support groups, literature, just at a touch at that one website. So this is a great information, a great way to empower our patients who are core to the overall success of our clinical trials. In our next slide, we show how the regulatory authorities embrace the concept of using patient-centricity. They published a 2019 guidance specifically for patients with ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease, encouraging drug developers to develop formulations that are more user-friendly. Current formulations require a patient visit to the hospital. It's an intravenous infusion that is given into the spinal column. This is very painful, and treatment outcomes are not necessarily the best because it burdens the patients. If we use new formulations, perhaps the subcutaneous injection, engage the regulatory authorities and how we can use adaptive design, use features of enrichment, decentralized clinical trials, and use all the technology that's available to us to benefit and improve patient outcomes. This is a win-win for drug companies and for the patients. In our next slide, we can see that when the sponsor engages our patients, there are so many advantages. In the drug development model, we can align the drug design and the clinical strategy that suits the patient best, which lowers our regulatory risk. Having information that is friendly for the patients to understand, this improves patient recruitment, engages patients, and retains patients, which then improves clinical trial outcomes. And with good clinical trial outcomes, that just makes the data that much more valuable. And with our regulatory authorities encouraging us to use patient-centric models, it improves and speeds up our products getting to the market sooner with positive patient outcomes. And when we think about it and take a step back, we are here to improve the health of our patients because they are the core to what we do. And with that, I move on and introduce Mike Porter, who will talk about integrated data management strategies. Thank you.
And thank you, Elaine. It's important that as we look ahead to the development, the integration of patients into that process is certainly critical. And it ties nicely into this discussion on integrated data management strategy because it's another source where we're going to be collecting a large amount of data as the patients become involved and report back in. And so how do we think about data management? How do we set up our systems to capture, analyze, and utilize that data to add value? And that'll be the focus of this part of the conversation. So if we look at the next slide, while there are many sources of data that we receive and need to manage, this conversation, I'm really just going to focus on looking at an integrated quality management system aspect, but certainly the conversation can apply more broadly to these other sources of data as well. And so if we think about a QMS system, right, we have numerous processes, each generating its own set of data, whether that's deviations or change control or recalls or audits, right? Each of these processes has a fair amount of data associated with them, and typically we will take a look at each of those systems within the context of itself. And so if we look at the next slide, as we think about sort of the typical approach, we do tend to look at it by quality system. We'll look at deviations and talk about that, and then we move to change control and talk about that, and then to audits. And so it really drives a view from a quality system process standpoint and how we're performing with compliance to the procedures that drive these quality systems. And typically we'll pull data. Sometimes it's fairly manual to pull that data together. And so we do that, and we report quarterly to management. And really what it drives is a measure of our compliance to the procedural requirements. Are we on time? Are we overdue? Right. And so, the typical approach, coming from either a paper or an electronic system that is driven around each of those individual processes, it can be fairly time consuming, and it can be very focused on reactionary types of measures to drive compliance. But if we think about moving towards meaningful key quality indicators or KQIs that really help us assess our risk management program holistically, what we want to do is look at the opportunity to review our data in a different way and really drive a more robust quality management system, as well as driving proactive ownership and accountability throughout the organization. And so if we think about implementation of an electronic quality management system and taking an integrated approach, we can now start to look at the data by process, right? By example, label accountability or informed consent in a clinical trial, right? We can see how many times those types of processes show up across our quality system, whether it's in an audit or whether it's in a deviation or whether it's in a change control, right? And really help us to look differently at the data and drive focus based upon risk that I can assess from that holistic view. These systems also offer the opportunity to continually monitor the data and provide real-time updates and feedback and answers to questions, rather than the manual processes that can be cumbersome that we can do on a quarterly type of basis. But really the goal with looking at how we set up our data within these systems is really to drive prioritization, to streamline and improve the overall compliance within the company by seeing the data differently. And many times when we set up an EQMS, we focus on the process and how the process is going to flow in the system, what the accountabilities are within the system for the different roles in the company. But many times we don't necessarily upfront think about the data that we want to analyze out of the system and think about how to organize that data in a way that gives us that integrated view and gives us the maximum value from the data analysis. So in the next slide that we have, this kind of gives some particular examples, right? In the typical approach, I'm looking at the percent overdue, either as a whole or by department. I'm looking at the number that are more than 30 or 90 days overdue, the number opened in a particular quarter, right? I'm looking at very discrete metrics for a particular element of the quality management system, whether that's deviations or audits or change controls, right? But if I take the more integrated approach, I can start to look at how many times does a particular process show up across all of my quality system elements, right? So label accountability, for instance, I can look at, what issues am I having in training, or how many quality events, or how many customer complaints came in, or how many times is that showing up in an audit or driving a recall, right? I can look across all of those because I might get a different risk assessment looking in total across my quality system, as opposed to if I just look at quality events or I just look at audit findings. And so it gives us a chance to view the data differently, but to do that, I need to be conscious of that as I build my data structure and plan my reporting capability. And if we move to the next slide, the advantage of this integrated approach is really the ability to drive a risk dashboard that looks at these various processes, right, and starts to measure the severity of the risk against the frequency of occurrence and how often it's happening, right? And this is very different from just a overdue mindset, right, or a compliance mindset against my procedure, because it's a different way to really drive signal detection and help me use risk to drive my resource assignments, whether that's time or dollars or effort, and to driving the improvements that are really going to drive the processes forward and also impact ownership and accountability across the organization. So this ability to view the data holistically is helpful to give me a very different perspective on where my risks lie versus simply looking at the number that are overdue within a given quality management system element. And again, I can take this concept and I can apply it broadly. I can apply it to all that patient information that's going to come in from being patient-centric in my development activities. I can apply it to other elements of my data, whether that be in the clinical space and the data that comes in through an EDMS or other systems, or even in the manufacturing space beyond just the QMS elements. So this ability to look holistically is an important one for us, especially as we generate new sources of data and think about how to manage those. And I like the quote on the next slide, which talks about the fact that many times we spend a lot of time designing the bridge, but don't think enough about the people that are going to cross it, right? And I think in concept here, we spend a lot of time thinking about our process design and how we're going to structure those and implement those within a software tool or an electronic quality management system in this case, right? But do we spend enough time upfront thinking about the data that's going to be generated, how we want to organize that data and use that data, and how we can represent that data in a way that really helps us add value to the company and also drive accountability and ownership within the company? So as we've talked so far, right, we look proactively at bringing patients into the process of drug development. We're talking here about being proactive and thinking about the data sources and how to manage that data. And in the next section, I'll turn it back over to Stephanie to talk about how we can be proactive and really thinking about the regulatory intelligence processes that we have and that we can leverage.
Thank you, Mike. So really want to start our conversation, building on what Elaine and Mike have shared, and talk a little bit about regulatory intelligence. We're going to start by really kind of aligning on a definition that I have pulled from a Regulatory Intelligence 101 book that's been published by the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society. And I use this definition because I think it, in my mind, sums up really what is it about regulatory intelligence that we're trying to accomplish. And she defines regulatory intelligence as the act of gathering and analyzing publicly available regulatory information. This includes communicating the implications of that information and monitoring the current regulatory environment for opportunities to shape future regulations, guidance, policy, and legislation. And I think it's important to understand that this gathering of publicly available information is just one piece of it. It's not sufficient to say that I'm going to have a regulatory intelligence program and I'm going to integrate that into my overall organization my overall quality management system, my overall drug development programs, if all we're doing is gathering the information, but we're not processing it or using it in any way, shape, or form. So as we look at this, there are many benefits to kind of considering implementing regulatory intelligence programs. And I would say as consultants, we see a lot of firms have really strong regulatory intelligence programs. And then we have others that are just beginning to broach this question of, do I need one? Why would I need one? What's the benefits of it? And I would say across the board, what we've seen is that a strong regulatory intelligence program that really does exactly what Ms. Tuttle describes in her book is going to increase or speed up the time to market. It's going to help you get through that drug approval process faster because you're going to be spending time gathering information about what might be changing around clinical expectations for your product as you're going through your clinical strategy execution. And that way, when you go to submit, you're aware of those things. You've already planned for any of those potential changes in requirements or expectations. Therefore, the likelihood that you get rejected on your application decreases because you've been proactive in understanding what those new requirements are. Regulatory intelligence programs also allow us to improve our risk management. Mike talked a lot about, looking at it from looking at data management, that helping to improve our risk management. Same thing about regulatory intelligence. If we think about it, I look at it as somebody who's been in the industry over 30 years. When I came into the industry, we're really talking about a situation where often it felt like we were getting a little bit hit out of the blue. We didn't have access to information like we do today. And it can be uncomfortable when all of a sudden a requirement changes and a compliance requirement changes, or a expectation around your submissions changes and you didn't see it coming, and therefore you didn't have time to plan for it. And now you're in a very reactive mode trying to get through this. If I use an example, we understand and have been looking for a revision to the European Annex 1 for years. We've been watching it go through the process. Being proactive and understanding where things are in the process, what's changing about the drafts of guidance documents, how that might impact my manufacturing facility or a submission, allows us to be more proactive. It allows us to be more efficient. It allows us to better control cost and minimize downtimes in a lot of our manufacturing facilities as well. So when you look at that combination of improving your risk management, oftentimes reducing risk, but you're gaining efficiencies, you're reducing costs, you're getting quicker about implementing, that's all centered around agility and decision making as well. So you get overall improved agility and decision making in the organization. And I think finally, the end result and end benefit of a really strong regulatory intelligence program is really fundamentally that you're on top of compliance, right? You understand what that regulatory landscape looks like. You see changes in regulatory expectations coming. You're prepared for them, and you're not being, in essence, caught with findings or needing to go through and fix things in a reactive mode. You're in a much more proactive space. And for those of you who might have seen Mike's in my webinar on quality management maturity, you're in those higher levels of quality management maturity. You are really looking at patient-centricity, you're looking at reduced risk, and you're looking at driving and setting the standards for what is to come in terms of the next generation of interpretation of regulations. So again, you do improve that compliance bottom line. So with understanding the benefits and why you might want to consider a regulatory intelligence program if it's not already part of your organization, naturally, a lot of folks say, okay, well, that's all great and dandy, but how do I actually go about doing this? And really what we're looking at from a regulatory intelligence process is looking at a cyclical, ongoing evolution of gathering data and information, going through interpreting, analyzing, and assessing that information, and then planning around what the response is to that information. So I'm going to talk through about each one of these in a little bit more detail. And we'll start with gathering data and information. And this is probably the biggest place where people, when they think of regulatory intelligence program, this is what they think of. They think of going out there, maybe getting email updates and pushes from regulatory health authorities on new regulations, new guidance documents, getting maybe news blasts from professional societies that provide some of that same kind of information. But that's only one slice. You can also go and look at, for instance, here in the US, you can look at warning letters that are made freely available on the US FDA website. You can gather intelligence as to where the FDA is focusing inspections and feed that in. And that's really across everything from not just manufacturing inspections, but I just saw the other day, the FDA published a multitude of warning letters to a number of different companies around marketing of unapproved products. So you can see where there are folks that haven't interpreted regulations about getting drug approvals correctly and apply that to your own business and see if that needs to be assessed. And then there are also many of those ways are really what we would consider more passive ways about gathering data. It kind of comes to you. You can automatically go out there and search it. You can do some research, but it doesn't take a lot of effort and energy relative to a more active methodology. And active methodologies for gathering data and information are things like going to conferences, networking with your peers around the world. Over the 30 years I've been in industry, as I've spent more time in quality assurance and regulatory compliance, I've gained a larger and larger network of friends and colleagues. And one of the interesting things is if you lean into that network, for example, around inspection intelligence, the US FDA is really great about publishing warning letters, but you have to go through freedom of information to get access to the 483 information, the raw inspectional information. And not every health authority around the world is really great about publicizing that information. So isn't it great if you can lean into this network of contacts that you have and say, hey, has anybody, we're about to go to, let's say, Australia with a new product. Has anybody gone to Australia recently? What do they know about the inspections? What have they seen? What have they seen about this product approval type? And start to have those conversations. And what you find is when you develop these little networks and lean into them, that you get real-time signals of what's going on in terms of interpretation and application of regulatory standards, guidances, and you can see the bar starting to move in many areas. And that's just a couple of examples of those more active ways of gathering data that require a little bit of critical thinking, that require some time and effort to invest in beyond just kind of I can go to a regulatory agency's website and find what I'm looking for. Well, yeah, we can do that. But sometimes the best intel about what's going on is from colleagues, is from peers in the industry. And so things like conferences, things like blog posts for people that are able to get to conferences if you're not able to get there, or leaning into your own networks is certainly a great way to do that. And so many folks will gather all that data and stop right there. That's really not a healthy and robust regulatory intelligence process, because what that does is it says, okay, well, you gathered the data, but you're not doing anything with it. And really what you need to do is take that data and put context around it. You need to take the context of your organization. What products are you manufacturing? What localities are you manufacturing or supplying into? So if you're manufacturing products for the US, the European market, and the Australian market, you need to make sure that your regulatory intelligence is covering all of those spaces and that you're assessing the impacts across your organization. It's really simple when you're a one product, one country type of operation. It gets more complex the more global you get, the more locations you have, the more products you're manufacturing. And this effort to take that organizational context and layer it across the information that you're gathering is a process. And it often requires people who have lots of expertise that can read and interpret, understand maybe the intent that's behind some of these proposed guidance documents or newer guidance documents, and look at the organization and say, okay, this doesn't apply to us, but this other one does. And this is what we need to think about. And this is who we need to start to get to look at this and really start to build some plans around where do we go from here. So this secondary phase is really, I think, one of the most important pieces of a healthy, robust regulatory intelligence process, because if you don't put the organizational context around that data and information, it's just data and information. It doesn't really convey into knowledge and action. And once you kind of move through that interpretation, and I'm going to analyze this information and I'm going to make some recommendations out of it, then it really comes into putting things into action. And this really stems around developing what the organization needs to do. Is there a response or a change or some sort of action that's necessary? And if so, what is that action that is ultimately necessary for the organization to take? And not just stopping there, but saying, okay, well, Jane is going to go own this activity now, right? She's going to make sure that we either get this implemented into our submissions or we're going to get this driven into our QMS. She's going to own this and she's going to report back once it's completed. And that way you kind of get this full closed loop of, I've gathered information, I've sifted through all of that, developed what's relevant, assessed how it impacts my organization. And now I'm proactively putting changes in place to make sure that I can meet those requirements as they evolve. And that is a fully functioning regulatory intelligence process. And I have to admit that when we sit down and have conversations with clients and they're really looking at regulatory intelligence as just gathering the data, gathering the information, that's really only the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. It's the easiest piece to do in some ways, shapes, and forms. But they miss the really impactful pieces and the ability to really stay ahead of things. And really, for instance, if you want to be on the front edge of quality management thought processes, then you have to have a strong regulatory intelligence program so that you can see the changes coming. You don't want to be on the back end after a new guidance is published going, oh, now I need to process this and deal with this in my company. So again, and you'll have a chance to ask us some questions around any of these topics, but certainly around this as we get to the Q&A portion here. But much like Mike talked about, I like to think about, and I want to summarize really regulatory intelligence with one of my favorite quotes from Jack Welch, who many of you may know, CEO of GE at one point in time. And he was prolific about many things, but one of the quotes that I tend to gravitate to when we talk about regulatory intelligence is just a standard business quote that he has that says, an organization's ability to learn and translate that learning into action rapidly is the ultimate competitive advantage. So if we think back to wanting to get our products to the patients who need them as quickly as possible, to find and meet those unmet needs, a strong regulatory intelligence program helps us with that process. It helps us with our time to market. It helps us find and make sure that we can get there as quickly as possibly and satisfying all the requirements along the way. And without belaboring the point too much, I think any type of modern quality management system that doesn't understand and employ a regulatory intelligence arm to it is never going to get beyond just basic reactive compliance. You're always going to feel like you're trying to catch up and that you're not able to take the time and effort and energy to plan appropriately. And as many of us who've been in the industry a long time know, that sometimes new guidance documents, sometimes regulatory changes mean that there are more significant and costly changes that a company has to make. And that takes time and effort. And so being able to see those signals early, Mike talked about early detection of signals, being able to see those signals early is extremely valuable. It puts us ahead of the pack when others aren't detecting those signals and reacting to them in the same manner. Apologies. And that's all really the prepared content that we had for today. And at this point, I want to make sure that if you haven't started entering questions, that you take a few moments and start to enter questions that you might have for us, because we do have about a good 15 minutes to take questions on whether it's patient centricity, integrated data management, or regulatory intelligence conversations as part of the webinar.
Thank you, Stephanie. Using the Conferences IO software, please submit your questions through the social Q&A interface. You will also have the option to unvote a question by clicking the arrow next to the question.
Thank you. So we'll start with the first one that's come in while those of you may be typing and getting other questions in. So this one's regarding regulatory intelligence. This person would like to know the consequences or what can be done after the assessment process, positive and negative outcomes. Okay, so let me reread this. Consequences of what can be done after the assessment process, what positive or negative outcomes can arise, and what can be done for both cases. So I think, Mike, I'll start with this one, and then maybe if you or Lane want to add to it, certainly you can do so. I think when you look at the assessment process, right, it's all going to be in context of what the signal or the data is telling you. So for instance, if we go back to that patient centricity guidance that Elaine mentioned around the Lou Gehrig's disease, ALS, right? So if you're manufacturing a potential new therapy for ALS, and we were starting to see signals of that, then you'd want to take that through, do the assessment. And what would happen is in that assessment process, your organization would see that there's a draft guidance around this. You'd say, okay, well, we are targeting a new product or new therapy for ALS. And then therefore, we want to take a look at this guidance. You may or may not want to issue public comments back, but you want to understand what an agency is proposing as the requirements for the clinical programs, and look at your current clinical programs, your current drug development process, and ascertain whether or not you might meet those requirements should they come into play as they are in the draft guidance. And then at that point, there's really that's that kind of immediate assessment. And part of that assessment is, okay, our clinical program, let's say it is compliant with those guidances, then you should be good. You wouldn't need to take any further action. You would want to monitor for a final guidance to come out and make sure nothing significant had changed from the draft you looked at and assessed. But let's say your clinical program isn't compliant with what they're proposing. Then in that case, you would actually want to put into action and escalate maybe some decisions to say, do we change course? Do we change our clinical strategy? Do we need to rerun some clinical trials? Do we want to put contingency plans in place and wait for the guidance document to be finalized? So hopefully that, I think, will hopefully answer the question. But Mike or Elaine, I'd be curious as to whether or not you guys have any additional thoughts on that.
I think you've summarized it well, Stephanie. I think as we are aware and do the assessment against the new regulations, right, it's important to tie that back into the risk management program, right, as well. And the top question there now, the quality risk management map on slide 22, we can certainly get back into that just a little bit. But I think having all these different data sources to help you identify where your processes aligned with regulatory expectation, and where are they functioning well, and where do you might have gaps, especially as these regulations change based upon your regulatory intelligence inputs, is important, so that you can kind of prioritize which ones. You can't solve all problems at the same time. We have to prioritize with the people and the dollars that we have. And certainly it's a key piece in looping that back into your quality risk management decision making.
Yeah. So if we look at the quality risk management map, as I was talking, that one moved to the top pretty quickly. So can you talk a little bit, Mike, maybe on how that quality risk management map is developed?
Sure. And is it possible to go back to that slide, Stephanie, while we're talking?
I think so.
Just to have it available to folks to see. But, I think, as we looked at that map, there were two elements to it, right? What's the relative risk from that process, right? And some processes are going to bring more potential risk than others. And so the left side was measuring that relative risk from a compliance standpoint, from a patient standpoint, and trying to measure which are lower and which are higher, and then the frequency of occurrence, right? How often is it happening? And that's where your data approach, your view on how you pull your data and look at your data can help you decide the frequency of occurrence, right? If I just look at deviations, I might get a different answer than if I look at deviations and audits and inspections and recalls, right? So, having that more holistic view to assess the frequency of occurrence is really what we want to measure. And then where I can then focus my risk management strategy is in that upper right quadrant, because those are the things that are higher risk and are happening more frequently, right? And so those are the things that I probably want to focus on and try to get under control and try to bring the occurrence down to the left side, right? I may not change the severity of the risk, but I can certainly change the frequency of occurrence by putting efforts into those programs. So that's really the intent here, is to look holistically at your data and then map that onto a grid like this, and then use that to help prioritize your resources and activities.
Yeah, and I think, Mike, your point on, we might not be able to influence the severity of the risk, which is this left hand axis, right? So for instance, severity of recalls is always pretty high, but what you can do is really try and decrease the occurrence of them, how many times you have them, the reasons for them. You can focus on really those pieces. And I think what's unique about this one, Mike, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, is it's really looks at, when you talked about that integrated approach, looking at it from more process orientation, that this is processes, and you're looking at that frequency of compliance issues, and that's what's really generating this kind of a dashboard.
It is. It's not just looking at your deviation data, right? But it's looking holistically at that integrated data view, whatever those data sources might be. And again, we were just focusing on the QMS system here, but it could be broader than that, even based upon some of those other data sources that you might have.
Yeah, perfect. I was able to get there, so let me get back to our Q&A.
Yeah, and this is why Stephanie navigates and does the slides.
Yeah. So I think we've taken care of the quality risk management map question. And I think hopefully for the person or the people who are upvoting the one on regulatory intelligence, hopefully the answers that Mike and I provided are there, but certainly if there are additional questions or more specific examples, type those into the Q&A box and we'll tackle those. This last question is always a question that we anticipate coming up, is really, are there specific software that combines all aspects of regulatory intelligence and QMS? And I'm going to tell you right now, no, there isn't one software that does it all. There are certainly really strong EQMS solutions and platforms. There are, frankly, when Mike and I last looked, there were hundreds of different platforms that are out there in today's day and age, a lot of cloud-based solutions tailored to any size of business, some focused on medical device operations, some focused on drugs and biologics, some focused on all product types. So, if you're embarking down selecting a QMS, I think the thing that Mike and I always advocate is when you're looking at requirements, considering the data that you want to be able to generate and getting to dashboards like we just were looking at. If you don't think about that when you're specifying those systems, it really can be difficult to mine that data afterwards. On the regulatory intelligence side of things, there are a number of ways you can go about this. You can set up an in-house program and hire some staff and do a lot of searching manually. You can pursue, there are some companies out there that have what I would call some software programs that basically offer and collect what I would call the passive information gathering piece. So the draft guidance documents, draft regulations, those types of pieces and information, and pull those into kind of a centralized system. And some of them, that's about the extent of what they offer. Others, maybe for a fee, you can get access to their experts' interpretation and perspectives on those guidance documents. And then there are one or two systems that are out there that not only take care of the data gathering piece, not only from pulling in data automatically into the platform, but allowing you to kind of pull in your own information, but also build some pretty sophisticated workflow engines within the systems to allow you to say, okay, well, I'm going to take this signal and I'm going to assign it to Jane, and she's going to do the assessment, and she's going to put in her results, and then it's going to go to specific tasks and actions. And much like you might see with modern change control system, right, that you can assign actions in an EQMS, you could assign actions in a regulatory intelligence platform. What it does create, though, is a little bit of a gap between these two, I think, core workhorse elements. And I love whoever asked this question. This is a great question. And I think that this is one of the areas that as we move forward and as technology continues to evolve and we are able to take AI and machine learning and all of these other really advanced techniques and algorithms to look at the data lakes that we're creating and to be able to take information from a regulatory intelligence system and our own quality management systems and feed them together for a more integrated picture. To me, that's kind of like the holy grail right now. That's what we'd all love to see, but I haven't seen it yet. So the bad news is the answer is really no. But I do have hope. Where we are today in terms of gathering and looking at regulatory intelligence is significantly different than where we were 10 years ago, let alone 5 years ago. So maybe in another couple of years, we'll see a new solution come out there. So we'll keep our fingers crossed. I think that takes care of that question. We'll give it maybe a minute or two to see if there's any other questions that come in. But if not, we do appreciate the opportunity, as always, to come and talk with you all, and for USP Education to host us and to help us with putting on these types of webinars and the opportunity to share thoughts and information with you guys. And of course, Mike and Elaine and I can always be found on LinkedIn if you're looking for another question outside the webinar. And we got one more in there, and we got plenty of time to answer it. We got a few more minutes. Interesting interpretation. Maybe, Mike, I'll let you take a stab at answering this one. Can regulatory guidelines be altered upon patient requests, or are they unchangeable?
Yeah, I think there are some fundamentals that have to be in place to protect patient safety, and that's considered across the larger population of patients. So an individual patient request, while it may be in the interest of that particular patient, it may not be in the interest of all patients. So the regulators have a burden and a responsibility to think about the collective good across. And so I doubt that that, some of those basic fundamentals would be driven by patient requests. But as you think about some of the guidance that's coming out around patient centricity, like the one that Elaine shared, those certainly are going to consider the patient input and make it easier for the patients to be compliant, to be engaged, and to get the benefit of the treatment. So I think, if you look at the 210, 211 side, probably not, right? But if you look at the guidance around how to integrate patients and patient centricity in this new model that we're moving towards, I think certainly there, patients have a large voice and are a key element in driving those guidance documents.
Yeah.
But Elaine, Stephanie, anything else to add?
Well, I think the only thing I might add is, we need to consider the context of the health authority that we're dealing with. If we're really talking about guidance, in most health authorities space, guidances aren't considered mandatory. They aren't considered in the same bucket as regulations. But I think if we're talking about something that's stipulated in a regulation, I agree with you 100%, Mike. I don't think there's going to be a single patient exception process that you can exercise. But certainly as you look at guidances around whether it's patient centricity, manufacturing requirements, quality requirements, drug development processes, guidances are intended to represent current thinking and best practices as they are at the time that they're published. But as we know, I think most of us who've been working, more than 10, 15 years, when I started working, technology and what I carried as a cell phone is very different than what I carry as a cell phone today. The same kind of thing happens around our thinking around a lot of these topics. So guidances can change, they can get revised. But they're really centered around that. So I think it's really incumbent upon the company to understand the patient request, why they're getting it, what they're really looking at. And I think if you go back to, I love the example that Elaine gave about the creams. She was sharing that with Mike and I as we were preparing for this webinar. And, the company thought this new formulation was going to be a great success. And the patients came back and said, no, we don't like it. It's sticky. It doesn't feel good on our skin. It doesn't really absorb. And, that's important feedback to be getting as part of that process, because you do want patients to be compliant with the treatment protocols that are necessary to make sure that they get the full therapeutic effect of the medicines that we're providing them. So I agree with you in principle. I don't think really there's an outlet for a patient-specific exemption to anything. But certainly there is some gray space, I think, in interpretation and application of guidances to a patient population.